Welcome. I'm Paula Dobriansky, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to the second annual iteration of the Looking North Conference on Security in the Arctic. As the Vice Chair of the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and also a member of the Atlantic Council's board, it is really my great privilege to kick off this conference, hosted in partnership with the Norwegian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Foreign Minister Søreide, Defense Minister Bakke Jensen, Ambassador Krutnes, and also the Director General for Security Policy at the Ministry of Defense, Henning Waglum, who are all joining us today. And we really thank you deeply for your support of the Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative and our longstanding close cooperation. We're really excited that all of you could be here today. Last year, we had the privilege to host this conference in the Norwegian ambassador's residence in Washington, D.C. And though I'm very glad that we are able to bring in perspectives from across the Atlantic today, Ambassador Krutnes, if you don't mind my saying, I do hope you'll be able to invite us to your residence next year. We have our fingers crossed. In the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, we work to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. We honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with our allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. The shifting security environment in the Arctic is one of those most pressing challenges and has been a priority of mine, as well as the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. As Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in the George W. Bush administration, I was the lead negotiator on U.S. climate change policy and saw firsthand how central international cooperation was to addressing challenges in the Arctic. Today, not only do climate change and its various effects pose a serious threat to the inhabitants of the Arctic, but increased activity in the region has also made the Arctic a geostrategic pressure point. Russia's growing militarization, China's rising investment and ambition in the region, and increased commercial traffic, all driven by climate change, have spurred a recognition that Arctic security requires new attention from the transatlantic community if the region is to remain stable and prosperous. Yet varying perspectives among our allies on how to approach security in the diverse Arctic environment have left us lacking a unified transatlantic strategy for the region. It is for that reason that we are so pleased to co-host Washington's flagship conference on Arctic security to inform the discussion on these topics. We are joined today by ministers, experts, senior government officials, and I suspect a good portion of the Arctic policy community in the audience for a series of speeches, fireside chats, and a panel discussion on the trends shaping the Arctic and how we can cooperate to address them. You can find a link to the agenda in the chat. And let me give a few practical notes before we get underway. I would like to remind everyone that this event is public and it's on the record. You can join the discussion on Twitter using our hashtag #LookingNorth. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions during each session using the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, and which we'll plan to get throughout the conference. And please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with each question you submit. Now, as my co-host of the conference, it is really my great privilege to introduce Ambassador Anniken Krutnes, Norway's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Krutnes came to Washington just this past year after serving as the Deputy Director General of the Department of Security Policy at the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. And she's no stranger to polar issues. She previously served as Norway's ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic affairs and is an expert in security policy, law of the sea, and Arctic issues. Ambassador Krutnes, it really is my great pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much for your partnership, and the floor is now yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dobriansky, for those kind words and for your introduction. And I promise you, next year we do this flagship event in the residence again, or maybe we should even do it in our newly renovated embassy that will be the place in DC for grand events. This year we have the pleasure that we can allow for more people to join us also across the Atlantic. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you. The Atlantic Council is a dear partner and friend of Norway. And today's event is a celebration of that friendship. And I want to thank you and the Council for everything you do to keep this relationship so strong. As Ambassador Dobriansky said, I was once Norway's ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic affairs, and the Arctic is near and dear to my heart. And I used to say that if you really want to understand the dynamics in the Arctic, the best way is, of course, to go there. And if you have the possibility, spend some time there. And that is why our partnership with the Atlantic Council is so great. The Norwegian MOD and the Atlantic Council have organized more than 10 trips to Norway for American researchers, staffers, reporters, and policymakers over the last years. And those trips give the participants insights into the realities of the Arctic and the Norwegian foreign and defense policy. Many of you who have had a chance to visit Norway are here today. And on these trips, you have seen that the Norwegian Arctic has bustling cities, airports, world-class universities, hospitals, award-winning restaurants, and innovative industries. And you've also noted that our Arctic has ice-free waters due to the Gulf Stream, which is different from the North American Arctic, and which has an impact on what kind of activities that can take place. And as some of you have seen firsthand, Norway is NATO's eyes and ears in the north. And that is a responsibility we take very, very seriously. Today, we will delve into several intertwined elements that affect the security in the Arctic in different ways. Climate change, economic interests, as well as geopolitical and military dynamics that are bringing increased attention to the region. And for the next couple of hours, we will hear from experts and policymakers from the United States, Norway, and several other countries involved in the Arctic. I am particularly pleased and also very proud that we have two distinguished speakers today, Minister of Foreign Affairs Ine Eriksen Søreide and Minister of Defense Frank Bakke-Jensen. And this is both a signal of how important Arctic issues are to us and how important this conference in particular and our cooperation with the Atlantic Council is. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Minister Søreide Eriksen. She does not need a long introduction. I believe she's a familiar face and voice to most of you. In her role as Minister of Foreign Affairs and previously as Minister of Defense, she has first-hand experience dealing with the challenges of a changing Arctic. Minister, it's a great pleasure. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anniken, and also to Ambassador Dobriansky. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here to speak again for ACUS. And I have to say, I was thinking about this morning, that one of the things that I miss by not traveling is, of course, to be in DC and take part in ACUS events. I think we all know, and Ambassador Krutnes mentioned it as well, that the cooperation between Norway and the US is really a very strong one. And we've seen that on several occasions policy-wise, but we've also seen it in the very strong relations that we have between the Ministry of Defense, ACUS, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think it is a good occasion also to provide some good words to ACUS for always providing not only timely, but also up-to-date, sharp political analysis. And the way that you work with the Arctic issues is something that we really do appreciate. The US is, as all of you know, Norway's closest ally, and our bilateral defense and security policy cooperation has only deepened and broadened over the last years. We enjoy long-standing and broad cooperation on Arctic issues as well, and I've been very pleased to welcome the US back into the Paris Agreement. It has a bearing on Arctic policies, and for those of you who followed the last ministerial of the Arctic Council, you will have seen that we were not able to reach a conclusion or a joint statement from the ministerial. The reasoning behind that was that the US at that time, in 2019, would not have different, I would say, references to climate change into the ministerial declaration. We still have been working very, very closely with the US in the working groups and with the same topics. But that is just to say that we think that when the US now has realigned itself with the Paris Agreement, we also think that will be a good sign for an even closer Arctic cooperation, a cooperation that is already very close. As all of you know, the rapid warming of the Arctic is dramatically endangering not only species and biodiversity, but also the people who live and the way people live in the Arctic. The rising temperatures in the Arctic, however, is not due to human activity in the Arctic. It is due to the rise in global emissions. And we think, as I know we have been discussing before as well, that this needs to be addressed on a global scale. And before moving on, I would just like to underline 2 points. One is that when we are discussing the Arctic, it is extremely important that we base our discussions on knowledge and facts. To base our discussions on science is actually extremely important in this environment. This second point I want to make is that international law must be the foundation of all activities in the Arctic, as it is everywhere else. And this reminder is something that you may think that is not necessary to bring up. But I find myself increasingly giving that reminder when I give talks like this, because it seems like not everyone is fully aware of the fact that international law applies to the Arctic. And I would say in particular, the 1982 UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. That is basis for an orderly and predictable relations between Arctic states, and also for a stable and peaceful international coexistence and cooperation in the North. This region does not need new governance structures, but we have to uphold and strengthen the governance structures that we have. And I mention this because from time to time, we hear discussions that what we need in the Arctic is a new governance structure. In my opinion, that is not needed, but we need to uphold the ones that we have. When I spoke to Secretary Blinken earlier on this month, I was also very glad to hear that the US wanted to strengthen the engagement with the Arctic Council. I call it the most important forum for Arctic issues, and this year it's a celebration of 25 years as an Arctic Council. And I think it is fair to say that the Arctic Council has been instrumental in setting the Arctic agenda. And I would point out key areas such as climate change and also building trust across borders. And when we meet again in Reykjavik in the end of May, I'm also hoping that the spirit of cooperation is with us. I'm quite hopeful and quite confident that it will be. Well, 1/3 of Norway's mainland territory and most of our sea areas are in the Arctic. And unlike many other parts of the region, the Norwegian Arctic is not just ice and snow. It's a highly developed part of our country. I know many of you have visited some of our northern cities. I heard the chat before we went online and how you have been visiting parts of the north of Norway. You will have seen this yourselves. In fact, some 9% of our population lives north of the Arctic Circle. That is a greater proportion than in any other country in the world. And people work, they innovate, they raise their kids, they have families, they go to school, they get their university diplomas, just like anywhere else in the world. I'm very proud to say that I also have my university degree from the University of Tromsø, which is the northernmost university of the world. And the north of Norway is also home to some of our leading academic and research institutions in areas such as marine research, fisheries, and natural resource management. We also focus on clean and emerging energy technologies, climate and environmental research, and sustainable ocean management. And there is a great potential for further cooperation between Norway and the US on a number of these issues. And I am very happy to say that we are exploring these on a daily basis. We are, from Norway's side, at the forefront in areas such as new types of ocean-based food production. We're also at the forefront when it comes to space and satellite activities linked to fields such as meteorology, maritime preparedness, ocean management, and combating marine pollution. As you may know, we have initiated a high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy. This is led by our Prime Minister, Erna Solberg. They just recently delivered their recommendations on the 3rd of December, and we are hoping that the very good discussion that came out of that recommendation will take us further through trying to operationalize the recommendations that were given. In November of last year, I presented a white paper to Parliament on Arctic issues. It provides the strategic direction. It sets out policy priorities for the years to come. And this white paper looks at international trends and also outlines the government's future ambitions for the Norwegian Arctic. I will just shortly say here that it's a result of, I would call it, a very extensive stakeholder process. We spent 2 years traveling, talking to people, everything from academics to artists, to business sector and innovation, and to young people. And one of the very interesting things were that we created a youth panel so that we were able to find the views of young people and what they thought about development of the region. And this was quite interesting because we have now gathered all their information, all their ideas. We put it in the white paper, but also as an annex, and we're following up. And what I find quite interesting is that it has proven to be some sort of an export issue for Norway, because now other countries and the EU who are working on their Arctic strategies want to have the same kind of involvement from young people, and I think that's a good thing. The key takeaway, though, from this white paper is that maintaining the north of Norway as a strong, resilient, and prosperous region is a vital investment in both security and also economic growth. And we know that this is an area of the country where the economic growth is strong. We know that it's an area of a lot of strategic interest, not only for Norway, but also for others. So what we do domestically in the north of Norway has major implications for our foreign and security policy and for our cross-border relations in the Arctic, including with Russia, that is our neighbor. And our Arctic policy has always reflected that we share a 198-kilometer border on land with Russia, a much longer sea border with Russia, and we cooperate very successfully in many areas, like joint fisheries management, like nuclear safety, and also on search and rescue, just to mention a few. We have some shared interest here. At the same time, at the state level, I think we also have to be very aware that our neighbor has become much more assertive and forward-leaning, much less predictable, and this is deeply worrying to us. Russia's military buildup across the border from Norway has increased significantly over the past 10 years. And this, of course, also is a strategic challenge for NATO. In addition to that, we have had to change our policy. We have had to make adjustments to our policies as well. So Russia has also substantially expanded both civilian and military infrastructure in the Arctic. It has developed new military capabilities, as most of you know, and with the strengthened response capacity and enhanced capacity also to strike targets from a longer distance and with greater precision. Our neighbor has also now acquired a new generation of submarines, strategic submarines, and the revival of the bastion defense concept, aiming at protecting Russia's capabilities, is also something that we look very closely into. I would, of course, like to go in depth on these issues because, as a former defense minister, this is very close to my heart. But I will leave that in the very capable hands of my successor, Frank Bakke-Jensen, who will come on later on. So Norway's policy towards Russia balances between deterrence and reassurance. It balances on this line and has done so for decades. We always have to meet Russia with firmness and predictability. Those two words are extremely important in our policies. And this policy remains unchanged. It has been so for many, many years, but it has become an ever more challenging task, I would say, in the face of a steadily deteriorating security environment and more international activity in and also focus on the Arctic. So just a few words on China before I conclude. And China's growing interest in the Arctic has attracted some attention. And we, of course, remain very vigilant to increase Chinese activity that has the potential consequences for our interests in the North. We have updated our National Security Act. We did so a couple of years ago. We want to meet an ever-changing security landscape with the necessary tools in our toolbox. That being said, the Chinese activity in the Norwegian part of the Arctic is still relatively limited. It primarily revolves around research and on climate and environment issues. China is, as all of you know, an observer to the Arctic Council. We think that they have been so far constructive in that role. Our impression is also that they so far have respected international law and governance structures in the Arctic. But this is an issue that we follow very closely. And we've sent a very clear message to Beijing that on Arctic governance in our dialogue with them. And in closing, I would just like to underline that the stability of the Arctic has long remained relatively unaffected by conflicts in other parts of the world. But with a more accessible Arctic comes also a greater focus on Norway's strategic location. The Arctic constitutes Norway's top strategic priority. It has been so for decades. It has obvious and natural reasons, and they have not become fewer now. And this is why we so greatly value partnerships that we have, for instance, with the Atlantic Council, to highlight Arctic issues, to provide enlightened discussions, as I'm absolutely sure this seminar will provide as well, and to produce updated and insightful reports on this region. So thank you again, everyone, for taking part, for inviting us. And it is so great to see good friends again, even though only on screen this time. Thank you.
Madam Minister, what a tour de force. It is just such a pleasure and an honor to be with you again this morning. And I so deeply remember your first set of remarks in the United States as Defense Minister on the Arctic, and your deep knowledge that you've now shared with all of us in so reassuring a way, but also so comprehensive across all of the Arctic. And You know that I'm Sherry Goodman, by the way. I'm a board director at the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and deeply involved from my earliest days with Norway, with Russia, working on many of these issues to provide both deterrence and reassurance, as you said, through Arctic military environmental cooperation and other programs that help to ensure stability. So let me start with you on some of these very important questions and topics that you raise. You had the opportunity, of course, recently just to meet virtually with Secretary Blinken. And I know you covered the Arctic and climate and many other important topics in the US-Norwegian relationship, which, as you know, is so vital. What strategic approach would you like to see the United States undertake today with respect to the Arctic?
Well, first of all, Sherry, thank you so much. And it's really great to see you again, too. I had a very good conversation with Secretary Blinken, and I have the pleasure of seeing him again next week at the Nato Ministerial, which I think will also be a good occasion to have some of these discussions taken in the format of NATO as well. That will actually be my first travel since I think August, September last year. So for a foreign minister to again be flying and traveling will be great, I have to say. And I think that the fact that the new Biden administration and also Secretary Blinken so very clearly states that it is a re-engagement in multilateralism, multilateral institutions, re-engaging, as I mentioned, to the Paris Agreement, that really sets a very important tone in the relations with I think all countries participating in these organizations. It sets a very important tone with allies. We are hoping, of course, to see Secretary Blinken in Reykjavik in the end of May, when we have our ministerial. But I do think that one of the most important things that the new administration can do is uphold the very strong, I would say, unity within the Arctic Council and also between the Arctic states on the fact that the governance structures that we have, they need to be respected and abided by. There is, as I mentioned, no need for new governance structures. There is a need to actually focus on and promote those we have. And every country who take interest and keen interest in the Arctic will have to be subordinate to these structures. That's the only way it can work. That's the way it has been working for decades, and it's been working well among countries who otherwise can disagree on issues, who otherwise can have even conflicts between them. But the fact that we have been focusing in the Arctic cooperation on very concrete issues, very science-based issues, is really something that I think will be important for the new administration to focus on as well. And as in any case, consult with allies, talk to allies and engage. That is always a very, very good recipe for a strong cooperation.
Great. Well, thank you. And I understand, of course, that you're referring to already the consultation you've had with Secretary Blinken, and now leading into both the Arctic Council Ministerial later in May and the NATO meeting. So let's take each of those in turn. With respect to the Arctic Council, and of course, reflecting the fact that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, which may remove some of the underlying sources of tension that existed in the past. Now we know we're in a transition to the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council. So share with us your sense of how, under the Russian leadership, and recognizing, the tensions that you mentioned in your remarks about Russia's growing increased presence and sometimes aggressiveness in the region, and recognizing also the cooperation that exists both within the Arctic Council and in the Norway-Russia relationship, as you observe on fisheries and search and rescue. How do we now, with the Russian chairmanship coming up, how do we move to strengthen the Arctic Council, and how do you see US and Norway working together in that regard?
Well, I think one of the the very important issues at hand is to engage actively, also, of course, at a ministerial level when you have ministerial meetings, which also the previous administration did. I think that we have to assess what kind of issues will be on the agenda for the Arctic Council in the next 2 years. One, of course, is the priorities that the Russian chairmanship has. And I think all of us need to focus on finding, I would say, positive ways of cooperating within the Arctic Council and looking into the priorities that the incoming chairmanship has. At the same time, there are issues, of course, that we do not raise in the Arctic Council, and there's a reason for that. Security policy issues does not belong in the Arctic Council. They belong in NATO. And that is why I'm talking about both the Arctic Council meeting and the NATO ministerial meeting coming up, because they are in a way interlinked. We need to find ways of cooperating where we have common interests with Russia and with other Arctic states. We do that through the Arctic Council. Doesn't mean that it's always agreement. It doesn't mean that we always see eye to eye on issues. But I would say by and large, it has been a very good and very cooperative spirit over these 25 years. And we've been managing, I would say, to find joint and common solutions on different issues. But we cannot shy away from the fact that the security landscape also in the Arctic is getting more difficult. And I use the example of the new strategic submarines as one example, posing a strategic challenge to NATO as well. I mean, we do not see Russia as a direct military threat towards Norway, but we see more and more signaling towards NATO and thereby Norway as a NATO member. We do see that the new strategic capabilities of Russia will effectively be able to challenge Allied reinforcement to Europe. And that is why we are concerned about it. And when we do not discuss these issues in the Arctic Council, it is because we want to also find areas for potential cooperation where we share interests. That could be on climate and environment issues. It could be on search and rescue. And as we have bilaterally also a very, very good joint fisheries management. So there are areas where we can cooperate, but we have to be very mindful of the development taking place on the security policy field. And that is very, very different now compared to what it was 10 years ago.
Right. Okay. So let's take each of those in turn. In the security policy area and in NATO in particular, I had the privilege of attending in Oslo the first NATO meeting on the Arctic in September of 2019. And so NATO, of course, Norway and other NATO Arctic nations were very engaged, but all 29 member nations were invited to participate. And so as we look at the security situation and providing a combination of both deterrence and reassurance to increasing Russian activity in the region, do you see a role for renewed security dialogue among security forces in the region, both within NATO for NATO member nations? Obviously, there's more than dialogue that occurs within NATO. There's actual preparation and many exercises. But there was, in a previous era, some dialogue even among security forces, including Russia, as a way of extending the confidence building that, for example, already occurs with the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, with the Joint Fisheries Agreement, in other dimensions. And are we entering an era where we need to think about those confidence building measures again among the security forces to reduce the risk of miscalculation or an accident or the need to respond and back up search and rescue missions?
Well, your last point is exactly why we have kept an open line between our operational headquarters and the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, precisely to avoid miscalculations, misinterpretations. The fact that we operate in much of the same area is, of course, something that we focus a lot on. That's working well, and that has been one of the very few things, in addition to search and rescue, the incidents at sea agreement, and so forth, that we have kept ever since we stopped all bilateral military cooperation and exchange in 2014 after the illegal annexation of Crimea. As a neighbor, it is absolutely paramount for us to react towards breach of international law. And I mean, if we do not stand up to that, who will? And that is also the reason why we have aligned ourselves with the restrictive measures of the EU. And we have been fully part of those measures ever since they were imposed in 2014. But at the same time, we, of course, for reasons of security in our own area, but also because of confidence building, as you mentioned, we are extremely open about our military exercises, for instance. When we had the big Trident Juncture exercise in Norway in 2018, we were very open directly to the Russians through Nato and also through, I would say, a very forward-leaning media outreach on the exercise. And it is really for us a very important thing to focus on how we can build that kind of confidence. At the same time, we don't see the same thing from Russia, and we expect Russia to be open about their activity as well. We've been very pleased to see now that the US have decided to prolong the New START agreement. That's been very, very good, very helpful. But we have some expectations towards Russia, and I think it is important that we as NATO allies focus on raising the bar for those expectations so that Russia do not think that they can behave or I would say have any posture they like in our neighborhood. I mean, this is an area of responsibility for NATO. We are here as Norway to be NATO's eyes and ears in the north, to interpret what is happening, to look into what is happening. But we need to focus on this as allies as well. And that is why I've been very happy to see how we've been working very closely with the previous administration on these issues. I'm very confident that we will continue that good cooperation with the current administration. And to raise Russia issues on NATO's agenda next week will be very important for us. And I'm quite confident looking into the past week that it will be important for Secretary Blinken as well.
Great. We only have a minute or so left, but I'm going to combine two important questions that build on your remarks, Madam Minister, because I think they're so important for our audience. One is you talked about strengthening cooperation. We're joining the Paris Agreement. The last agreement signed with the Arctic Council was on research, scientific research, which is so important. What opportunities might you see to deepen research on climate change, perhaps black carbon, which we know is important in the region? And then finally, just share with us a little bit more about the innovation vision and the youth for the Arctic that can be an inspiration, I think, for many other Arctic nations, including our own, as we think about taking a whole of society approach to addressing the Arctic here in the US as well.
Well, Sherry, I'll try as good as I can in a very short period of time to answer these extremely extensive questions. To be very honest, I think that on climate change and research, we of course already have a very good and strong cooperation among the Arctic states. And even though there has been differences, as I mentioned in my introduction, on the previous US administration's willingness to refer to climate change in formal documents, the work in the working groups have really been going very well, very smoothly, and with full intensity, I would say, since we had this meeting in Rovaniemi. And I would like to, if you let me, also give a little bit of a shout out to Jim DeHart, because he's really been a champion in this, not only because he was in Norway for such a long time, but also because he's been working so very good with these Arctic issues, and also now. So I think within the framework of climate change, there are enormous opportunities for science-based cooperation, where all countries and all Arctic states are interested in putting science at the core, to be well informed, to focus on the areas where there is a need for adaptation, where there is a need for finding solutions that can apply to the Arctic environment, because the Arctic environment is, as everyone knows, quite fragile, and climate change takes place twice as fast in the Arctic as anywhere else on the globe. It of course makes it a very interesting research laboratory in a way, but it also makes it fragile in a way that makes us, I would say, we have to act on this very, very quickly. So we are doing our part, and I know that other countries in the region, of course, are focusing as much as we are on this. So climate change is, in my opinion, a very, very interesting area for a closer cooperation. It is also an area where all the Arctic states see much of the same challenge. And there is really, at least I haven't seen in my years in government, that this is an area of conflict or kind of diverging views to a large extent among the Arctic states. So this is a good opportunity. On the youth panel, well, it was the idea of gathering the youth panel was to focus not only on well, how should I say this without sounding, well, not only focus on those who are 50 years and older, who have quite, I would say, quite a fixed opinion on what it is to be living in the North, what opportunities and challenges you have. But we wanted to hear the voices of those who were much, much younger and those who are planning to develop and shape the Arctic in the future. And I can assure you that their challenges, their wishes, and their ideas were quite different from some of the ideas, otherwise good ideas, we heard also from the more, I would say, grown-up audience. And it provided us with a lot of ideas we had not thought of. It provided us, I would say, with a lot of energy into the work. And we immediately adopted many of the ideas. And some of the ideas, I have to say, were about things that could sound very easy to fix, but isn't. Like, why should we stay on? Why should we not move out of this region to have our education or to raise our families or to find work? And our point is that if we are to uphold the region, as I said, as one of the most innovative, interesting regions with a lot of academic power, we have to make sure that young people today plan their future in the Arctic. And the Arctic is also extremely diverse. You have countries with Arctic areas that primarily consists of nature and not too much of, I would say, cities like we have, because we have the Gulf Stream. So we have an ability to have a lot of inhabitants in our northern part. That changes the calculus for us compared to many other countries. That also changes the way our Arctic is composed compared to other countries. We had to make sure that we heard these young voices, and I can assure you, we also had a lot of fun. We participated in different events that they hosted. One of the first meetings the Prime Minister had with them, of course, virtually, you could easily see that young people who are now very used to having virtual events, some of them were extremely laid back, I would say, in the meeting with the Prime Minister in their homes. It was quite funny, actually, but it opened up, that's the whole point. It opened up a conversation and a dialogue that we so sorely needed in this work. And that is why this is the first white paper of its kind that actually focuses on 3 pillars. One is, of course, the international development in the Arctic. The second pillar is our neighborly relations. And the third pillar is the development of the north of Norway. So that was the idea behind it. We are glad to export this idea to other countries. And we've been asked actually quite often how we can, or to share some experiences from this.
Well, thank you. That was brilliant. And we may ask you to export that further in this form and others as we get going on looking at the US.
We do it for free.
Yeah, that's great. Even better. Madam Minister, thank you so much for your time and your engagement with us this morning. It is so personally wonderful, and for the Atlantic Council, and I think for all Americans to hear your personal story and share Norway's vision, cooperation, and dedication to Arctic matters. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and best of luck with the rest of the seminar.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to turn the show over to Ali Rogan, the very talented foreign affairs producer of the PBS NewsHour. of which I'm deeply fond. So thank you, Ali, and over to you in the next panel.
Sherry, thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. As Sherry mentioned, my name is Ali Rogan. I'm a foreign affairs producer with the PBS NewsHour, and I actually had the honor of hosting this expert panel last year as well. That was in February 2020, right before everybody's world turned upside down and ground to a halt. But of course, the COVID-19 pandemic didn't stop developments in the Arctic. In addition to being strategically critical in its own right, the Arctic is ground zero for geopolitical dynamics playing out worldwide. The Arctic's challenges are indeed the world's challenges. And while we're not going to solve them all here in the next hour, the group of experts assembled is certainly the best equipped to discuss some of the solutions. I want to introduce them, beginning with James DeHart, the U.S. coordinator for the Arctic region at the State Department. We also have with us Sharon Burke, the senior advisor with the International Security Program and Resource Security Program at the New America Foundation. Katarzyna Zisk is a professor, the deputy director and head of the Center for Security Policy at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. And Thomas Nielsen is the editor of the Independent Barents Observer. In the interest of keeping things moving, I'm going to pose questions to specific people, but I do encourage all of the panelists to weigh in on any question if they feel compelled to do so. About 10 minutes after 10 a.m., I'm going to turn to questions from the virtual audience. To kick things off, I'm going to ask our panelists a question that was inspired by an article Katarzyna wrote in 2019. It was entitled, "The Future of the Arctic is Russian, or is it?" So I'd like to put a little spin on that and ask all of our panelists to complete the following sentence and then explain what you mean, give it about 3 minutes or so we do a quick lightning round, and then we'll get into some other questions. But the sentence I would like you to complete is, "The future of the Arctic is blank." Thomas, why don't we start with you?
I think the future of the Arctic is today. I think that's very important to have in mind. I think that we're going to see in the years to come much more of what we already see the frame of. That is not necessarily great, but it's not necessarily terrible either. I'm sitting here at the Barents Observer, which is a news online in the border area between Norway, the European Union with Finland. And from my office, I only have a 10-minute drive to Russia's Kola Peninsula. And as we heard our foreign minister of Norway, Ine Eriksen Søreide, said, there have been quite dramatic changes on Russia's Kola Peninsula over the years in terms of military arms buildup. There is important issues we see. For instance, there ain't necessarily any potentials for military conflict in the Arctic as such, because everything is by the law up here. There is no disputed questions about natural resources. Borderlines are more or less, except on the top of the North Pole, are kind of cleared out between the 5 Arctic nations. But I want to use my short introduction here today in the panel to highlight one very important thing, and that is for the Arctic to stay safe, for the Arctic to stay as an area without conflicts, we need more openness than we see today. As a journalist, I have big problems by cooperating inside Russia today. This has been a dramatic change over the last few months. When something happens with Russia's Northern Fleet, before I could call the press spokesperson of the Russian Northern Fleet and get an answer. Today, I, as a foreign journalist, I'm not allowed to talk with him. So I'm only given the answer to send a request to Russia's Ministry of Defense in Moscow. And maybe they answer, very often they don't do it, but if they do it after a week or after 2. And if I'm writing a story about a nuclear-powered submarine that is on fire only 60 nautical miles from the border of Norway, I'm sorry, I can't wait for such a long period of time. So talking about the Arctic today, we are unfortunately seeing that the carpet is coming down, not only for international cross-border relations, but mainly, and this is my deepest worry, is that the carpet is coming down within Russia. There ain't any independent media that can focus on these issues up north in anymore. And there are very few NGOs, there are very few opposition politicians in Murmansk, in Archangel, in northern part of Siberia, who are able to ask critical questions. So unfortunately, that is my short answer for this opening, Ali. But openness is important, and my little hope now, I said in the beginning that not everything is terrible. There is something great also. I really, really hope that Russia will use its chairmanship period for the Arctic Council to follow their own verdicts, their own headlines for the Arctic, that Arctic is a territory of dialogue. And hopefully that dialogue will be open for more people than we see today.
Katarzyna Zisk, it was your headline about Russia's influence in the Arctic that inspired this opening question. So let's go to you next.
Well, thank you, Ali. I am, of course, tempted to say that the future of the Arctic is Russian, but of course, the answer to this question is more complex. It is true on the one hand that the Russian military and other Russian activities will continue to exert a strong impact on the regional developments because, as we know, Russia is in control of nearly half of the latitudinal circle, including most of the Northern Sea route, vast natural resources, and having an extensive and growing military presence and activities in the region. So Russia has both stakes, and it is in a unique position to continue influencing the region, the regional strategic and security environment. But at the same time, the Arctic is not an insulated security space. It is likely to get farther intertwined with supra-regional and with global issues and problems as it continues to open up to human activity, both commercial and military. So this also includes strategic competitive dynamics we've already observed between major stakeholders, Russia, of course, the United States, but also China and other actors. But at the same time, I think the complexity of the regional development is also related to the fact that many of the regional developments promise to be non-linear. So on the one hand, we know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has subsequently repeated that the Arctic is to continue to be most affected actually by the increasing temperatures. So allowing for a broader access to energy, to fish resources, near year-round shipping through the Northeast and Northwest passages maybe also at some point. And also for more surface naval deployments in the future. And this all will be putting more pressure on the bilateral and multilateral relations in the Arctic. But at the same time, the weather patterns, for instance, they may become more violent and less predictable, making actually the access to the region more difficult. Remaining legal disputes, there are still some, there are not that many, but still, they may become more inflamed and may complicate the political and security landscape in the region. And also, while maritime shipping and energy exploration will be a subject to commercial viability and dynamics on global commodity markets, this also will be something that is going to change and may shift in one way or another. So there is also, of course, the question about the speed and scale of the shift to green and sustainable energy resources and how this may impact the commercial developments in the region. So I think in general, there is a broad set of both opportunities and challenges in the region. And so I would say that the future of the Arctic is more complex. And that is why it will be more central to strategic interests of Russia, of the United States, of China, and also other major stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Sharon next, and then lastly to Coordinator DeHart, please.
Thanks so much, Ali. And it's a great question, and I can't give you a single answer. And that reflects my own split, my own divided feelings about this. So the future for the Arctic is exciting and terrible. So let me talk to you first as a former defense official, what I mean by exciting or compelling. This is like clean sheet geostrategics, right? It's a clean sheet geostrategic landscape. It's a new frontier, probably the last terrestrial frontier in the world. An entirely new sea line of communication is opening up, new resources, as Katerina said, from oil and gas to critical minerals. All of this is opening up for the very first time. This is now where the contest, the global contest between autocracy and democracy is coming to a head in some fairly dramatic ways. So this is all about access, resources, in defense terms, access to the area, trade and commercial and military traffic through the area, resources, border protection, which for the United States is something we haven't worried about in such an immediate, visceral way since the Cold War. It's about advanced technologies and making sure that you're ready for the defense environment of the future. And that means we're hearing it now from multiple US military strategies. Every service has a strategy. The Army just put theirs out, that this means more investment, more. We need more. We need more platforms, including heavy icebreakers. We need more bases. We need a base in the region. We need a deep water port at Nome. We need more access. We need more intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. We're going to be needing to mine, extract resources. We need more alliances and partnerships and to deepen those relationships and make them stronger. So that's, as a defense official, it kind of gets your blood up, right? This is a big deal. But as a climate security expert, my reaction is really different, which is if the Arctic is melted enough for all of that to be relevant, we are in big trouble. If the ice has melted that much that there's an open ocean, well, first of all, the ocean opening up means that there's also a bigger heat sink there. Right now, the ice reflects sunlight. So that means it's actually making things worse in that sense. It means methane releases, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, more so than carbon dioxide. It means a sea level rise globally, potentially a catastrophic sea level rise. It means if we're having open Arctic, it means that we are in an unstoppable worst case climate change scenario. And even now, we're already seeing big costs for the melt that's going on. Indigenous communities are at risk, and some are already being moved. Just the cost of moving a single village, Newtok, is estimated, I think, around $100 million. There are lots of endangered lives and livelihoods and physical places across the region. Permafrost melt is a very expensive thing to deal with. Over the summer, the Russians had a major oil spill at Norilsk Nickel, and I think just recently, within the last couple of weeks, the Russians have filed a $2.1 billion lawsuit, or fine rather, against Norilsk. So, I mean, the cost, that's one thing, one spill, one cracked tank. There's shifts in fisheries, including in ways that may really harm the productivity of what is a very considerable resource in the region. Then there are much bigger costs from global runaway climate change in places other than the Arctic. So in a lot of ways, the real question about this autocracy-democracy contest is whether we can gather together with such different systems to actually cut greenhouse gas emissions and cooperate with each other enough to transform the global economy and also to adapt to the changes that are already happening and are locked in. That's the biggest Arctic question on some way, and that is the terrible part. So in some ways, you could say one of the most important Arctic investments is happening right now in Alaska, with the dialogue between the United States and China that was off to a not great start yesterday, but that's okay. They're sitting down and talking, and they're working it out. And they're, also everybody has to set their negotiating positions. But the fact that there's a direct dialogue, that's one of the most important investments we can have. Another important investment will be in Washington, D.C. on April 22nd. And I'm talking about important Arctic investments, because then we're going to have a World Climate Summit where the United States is going to try to raise the ambition. And then, of course, another very important Arctic investment is going to be in Scotland this fall with the Conference of Parties on the climate negotiations, the follow-on to the Paris Accords. So, it's terrible and it's exciting. And, it's as a former defense official, I feel both all at once, but hopefully you see where the real action needs to be.
Excellent. Coordinator DeHart.
Ali, thanks so much, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to this fantastic conference. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the future of the Arctic is peace. It's peace. And I say this with some measure of confidence, but it will take some continued work, I think, from all of us to make sure that this is the case. And I'm not downplaying the risks here. We have real concerns with Russian activities in the region. There are risks to the region that come from the outside. So we have to have our eyes open to the potential threats and the risks that we face. When we look at Russian activities, the solution really begins with NATO, and we have to be present together, we have to be capable together, we have to be unified as an alliance when we look at the security challenges that we face in the region. But what gives me confidence is the facts on the ground and the reality and the history. This is a region at peace. It's a region that in many respects, the status quo was enviable. There is amazing cooperation that takes place in the scientific research community. There is remarkable cooperation that takes place through the Arctic Council, which we view as the premier multilateral institution, including constructive cooperation with Russia in that Arctic Council context. And then I think an extremely wise observation by Foreign Minister Soriaida, the strength of and prevalence of international law, international rules, and existing governance in the region. And we have to come back to this. It's foundational for stability and for predictability, but there is a system to manage resources, to manage freedom of navigation, to address extended continental shelf claims. Countries have adhered to those rules so far. I think the essential ingredient is we have to make sure that countries continue to follow those rules, and we'll be in a good place if they do. I'm happy to report that in our new administration, which hopefully folks have seen that our president released interim national security guidance a couple of weeks ago in lieu of a fully fleshed out national security strategy, and some really important themes there that apply directly to the Arctic. One is the importance of upholding international rules, international law, institutions that serve us. The second is revitalizing our alliances, and it's through our close alliances and partnerships in the Arctic that we are going to address whatever security risks emerge and keep things peaceful. And then third, really important theme, we've got to, for the United States, we've got to make foreign policy make sense to American citizens and show the benefits and connect our domestic and foreign policy priorities. Really important with the state of Alaska. And I would extend that out to the whole Arctic region, to the peoples of the region. They've got to have a voice in this, and we've got to have their interests front and center. I will stop there. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much. And my first question goes back to you, Coordinator DeHart. I want to ask about the fact that you're the first coordinator that the State Department has had for the Arctic region, obviously a position you took over towards the end of the Trump administration. And some of the hallmarks of the Donald Trump foreign policy or the Arctic policy were boldness against China and a view that climate change was more of an opportunity than it was as a problem to solve. So my question for you is, do you view the Biden Arctic strategy as a continuation of the Trump policy or as a deviation from it?
Well, yes. So I'm the first coordinator. There's a similar position that Admiral Papp held some years back under the Obama administration. I was brought on board because the previous administration wanted to have a balanced approach, integrate all of our efforts and address all of our interests there. I think, which was, a good approach in concept. What was missing was climate. We now have a strong policy on climate. I'm happy to say, and we're raising the level of our ambition, including in the Arctic and tackling black carbon and methane. And I think more to follow as we look ahead to the Arctic Council Ministerial that's coming up in May. There's both change and continuity here. I think the security risks and challenges, obviously they don't immediately go away. And we're having frank discussions up in Alaska today, as was mentioned, and we've got concerns, serious concerns and objections to how Russia operates, including in the Arctic. So there's, I would say, quite a lot of continuity there because there's continuity of risks and threats.
So to follow on that, I want to first turn to the security aspect and then ask specifically about the climate change. Obviously, these two issues are very interrelated, but I want to take them one at a time. First, I want to go to Tomas and Katarzyna. You've both been tracking and literally watching out of your front door Russian and Chinese activity in the Arctic. Obviously, Tomas, you mentioned that you live right on the border with Russia, and Katarzyna, you've been writing extensively about these issues. So I wanted to ask both of you, let's start with Tomas and then go to Katarzyna. What concerns you most about Russia's activities in the Arctic, and what concerns you the most about China's?
Your last question is the easiest to answer because there is a lot of headlines in the world and there is a lot of speeches. It's mentioned that many Arctic conferences about China's activities from a military perspective in the Arctic. Well, so far I haven't seen one single Chinese naval vessel, not one single Chinese military plane flying in our part of the Arctic. There was a Chinese naval delegation, including the commander of the Chinese Navy, visiting Severomorsk, which is the Russian Northern Fleet's headquarters 2 years ago. And what they discussed was not made public. But we was at that time interviewing people, speculating if the Chinese Navy would participate in a kind of joint exercise with Russia up in the north, in the Barents Sea or along the Northern Sea route. That did not happen. And still, when Russia had its huge naval exercises in the east, the Vostok exercise in the Black Sea area and in the Baltic, the Chinese Navy have at all those three places and exercises been participating with a naval vessel, but still not here up in the north. So it will be very interesting to see what happens in September this year when Vostok, when Zapad 2021, the huge military biannual exercise will happen. Will there be any Chinese naval vessels? But there are no indications of that for now. When it comes to Russia, as I said in my opening remarks, things have changed quite seen from the ground here in the north quite dramatically over the last few years. And only 2 weeks ago, we had a huge Russian warship that for the first time since the end of the Soviet Union period, more than 30 years ago, was actually sailing west of the Fisherman Peninsula. That means very, very close into the territorial waters of Norway. They did not violate any borderlines, maritime borderlines and so on, but we have not seen that before, such a huge warship. And that came at the very same time as the US Air Force were deploying 4 B-1 bombers to Ørland Airport, which is way south in the southern part of Norway. But this Russia's way of signalizing political and military issues by doing activities very close to Norwegian waters, that is something new, even with exercises off the coast of in the Norwegian Sea, which is west of North Cape. They are sailing into new areas where we haven't seen that before. But still, Russia does not violate international law. They are sailing much more, they are flying much more. My big worry is that when something goes wrong, when there is an accident, like we have seen with the testing of this new doomsday's weapon, this nuclear-powered cruise missile, the accident that caused a spike in radiation, they deny it, they don't give public information, and all such kind of lack of openness and lack of transparency, that can fuel misinterpretation. And that is my big worry, both domestically in Russia and also among us as neighboring countries to the Russian Northern Fleet's huge activities.
As an aside, I would mention before, Katarzyna, we turn to you, that perhaps it's worth noting that it seems at least that China's interests in the region are manifesting themselves in a different way than are Russia's. So where you have the military buildup with regard to Russia, you know, I definitely want to also talk about what China seems to be doing on the investment side, especially when it comes to Greenland. But with that said, I'd love to turn to Katarzyna and get some of your thoughts.
Thank you very much. So I think I would agree with Thomas that, and also I think Minister Saraida mentioned that earlier, that there are some aspects of the Russian development and behavior in the region which are concerning. I mean, to start with, this large-scale military buildup that has been expanding for over a decade is one point to make. Russia has expanded both infrastructure investments in basically all defense branches. And also the Russian military activity has been on the rise, sharply increased since 2007. And the complexity of the operation has become, has expanded. And the problem with that is, well, yes, one thing is that some of these exercises, they are not announced, they happen very quickly. The operational pattern of Russia in the region has been changing and has become more unpredictable, which is concerning, because it is very hard to see what Russia is doing in the Arctic detached from what Russia is doing in other regions, the Baltic, the Black Sea, or in Syria. So that is one aspect of that. In general, I think the asymmetry of power between Russia and other stakeholders in the region has also increased. What also concerns me is some of the programs, military weapon programs that Russia is developing in and for the Arctic, and which include also unmanned weapon systems, some of the new technologies that Russia is experimenting with, which are very concerning. One is the Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle. Another is the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile. And there are a number of others. I will be very closely following, especially the Russian application of the novel and breakthrough technologies in the region, how they might be used in the Arctic. Also, we've seen some of the other aspects of this development is signaling, as Thomas has mentioned, the military muscle flexing, simulation of bombings on the Norwegian territory happened on a number of occasions, GPS jamming, etc. So the conduct, these aspects of the conduct has been quite problematic. When it comes to China, I think I also would agree with to date, China has been very, in a way, quiet and collaborative partner in the Arctic, at least thus far, rarely confronting or during negotiations. One example is the Polar Code of the International Maritime Organization, or the regulation on fisheries in the high seas. But I think the problem is that, as in other places on the globe, Chinese economic and other activities which are not necessarily non-traditionally security related, they are perceived through the lenses of geopolitical influence. And so it's very hard to detach what China is doing in the Arctic from China being some kind of a different player in different places. So I think the one concern is that in the future, the question is whether the expanding Chinese presence, political, economic, research, science, diplomatic in the Arctic, may be followed by some kind of form of security and military presence sometime in the future. And to what extent China's policies of challenging the status quo and militarization of maritime claims that we observed in other regions could potentially apply also at some point in the Arctic. So again, I think I would just underline that China's increasing presence in the Arctic may contribute to raising tensions in the future, because the Arctic, again, is not an insulated security space. What happens in other regions and how the main stakeholders act and behave in other regions, so Russia, China, but also the United States, it will spill over also to the Arctic region.
Well, that's a wonderful segue for my next question, which is to Coordinator DeHart to tell us, how does the United States respond to the various dynamics that Katarzyna and Tomas just laid out?
Yeah, thanks very much. Russia and China both pose challenges. I think very, very different kinds of challenges. They're distinct sort of risks. I think Russia much more in the hard security realm, and I'm not sure I can add much to what colleagues have already said. I think very insightfully about concerns about Russian activities. China looks at the region, I think, takes a long-term view, and there's no meaningful Chinese military presence at the moment in the Arctic. There is clear interest in greater presence and involvement in the Arctic by China. I think we have to look at a couple of things. One is the clear Chinese interest in gaining footholds around and across the region. Their clear interest in acquiring infrastructure, and in some cases strategic infrastructure, in acquiring mineral rights, licenses that would enable them to establish a foothold, develop other forms of infrastructure. I think they're taking a long-term look at this, and also we have to look at how they've approached development and investment in other parts of the world. I think where the standards that they have brought have not been high, and their approaches have been less than transparent, have led to unsustainable debt burdens, have led to environmental damage and other problems. So we take the experience elsewhere as a cautionary tale. But I think the bottom line here is that there will be Chinese investment. We're certainly not saying no to that. We have Chinese investment in the United States. It's got to adhere to certain standards, and it's important that countries be able to look at Chinese activities, whether it's investment or acquisition of infrastructure or science platforms, look at those activities through a national security lens and come to a reasoned judgment about whether they pose national security risks. And I think this is being done now among the governments in the Arctic region and more broadly, and that's a positive thing.
I want to turn to climate change. I want to ask first Sharon, and then Coordinator DeHart, if you want to weigh in, that would also be great. As Coordinator DeHart mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, the Biden administration's position on climate change is very much more aligned with that of the rest of the Arctic Council. So I want to know, how does the US, seeing eye to eye with its partners on this issue, change the game? How does it affect the ability to make progress on the pressing issues as it relates to climate change? So Sharon, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Allie. And just a quick comment on, I thought what all of my colleagues said about China and Russia in the region was great and really important. And also it's worth pointing out that there's nothing inherently wrong about their actions and presence. Of course, China wants to cut 2 weeks off of the transit from Asia to Europe. Of course, Russia is going to feel existential about their very, very long northern border. It's their behavior that's problematic. And I would say in the case of China, even if there aren't military presence in the Arctic, for them, it's all strategic. It's all the same. So their presence and their declaration of being a near Arctic power is all very concerning. When it comes to climate change, the Biden administration change in putting that as one of their top 4 priorities does, as you said, strengthen the alliance and the partnerships in the region in a very significant way. There is not a country in the Arctic other than Russia that doesn't put climate change as a top priority also. So it gives us a way to come together. It's also, as I said before, a really urgent driving issue in the Arctic and around the world. So this change in policy is a significant force in bringing the parties together. And also the question becomes too, as everyone has made clear, cooperation in the Arctic, there is a long history of that, scientific cooperation, environmental cooperation. There's a long history of, as the coordinator said, of peace in the region and collaboration. We also need to see how that tradition can help translate to climate change. Because as much as the alliance, and particularly the US-Canada alliance, is going to be important for seeing gains in climate change and peace in the Arctic, it can't happen without Russia and China. So we also have to have a way to leverage some of these peaceful collaborative mechanisms to see cooperation in climate change. But it's a very significant global diplomatic change that I think will pay dividends for all of these relationships and for specifically the Arctic.
Coordinator DeHart, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I think I would just add briefly. So as our administration has said, we need to integrate our ambitious efforts on climate change, integrate them into all fora where it makes sense to do so, into all lines of effort where it makes sense to do so. It clearly makes sense to do so in the Arctic Council. Hopefully, the efforts that we undertake there will contribute to our broader global effort to tackle what we view as a crisis. And so I think that's number one. And I think, as a secondary effect of that, it does, I think, give the opportunity of making sure that we are in complete solidarity on the Arctic Council, sort of revitalizes that aspect of the Council's work, and opens up avenues for new work in the Council.
Thomas Nielsen, did you want to add something? It looked like.
Yes, I have a very interesting approach on this because we very often hear that climate change is not created in the Arctic, but it's affecting the Arctic most. As a reporter, we are covering these issues every day in the Barents Observer, and we see something very, very important that is happening now in the Arctic, and that is trying to find the solutions on how to solve the problems of climate changes. And there are no other places in Europe which have bigger investments into battery technology for powering electric vehicles, electric ferries, electric snowmobiles, electric buses, electric lorries, electric mining equipment than exactly up here north of the Arctic Circle. This is happening both in northern Norway and northern Sweden. It's creating thousands and thousands of new jobs. And the main reason why companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Tesla, Elon Musk, and so on is looking north for production of batteries is because all the clean energy that is available here. So such production of the mining equipment for nickel, copper, cobalt, and so on, and the battery technology are really taking off and boosting up here. And we see it on the coast of the Kola Peninsula in Russia and on the coast of Norway to the Barents Sea. There are no other places in Europe which have more wind. And that wind will be utilized to produce green hydrogen that can then be shipped over the Northern Sea route to Asia for powering zero-emission cars, zero-emission vessels, etc., etc. And this is an area where both the European Arctic countries, the United States, Canada, and Russia can cooperate to boost economical outfits for the future. And the latest news we wrote there in the Barents Observer now is that Novatek, Russia's biggest private gas company, which is developing the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia, even they are now looking into how to produce hydrogen based on natural gas with CCC, which means carbon capture without any pollution out and creating more greenhouse gases. So the Arctic did not create climate changes, but the Arctic plays a very, very vital role in finding industrial solutions for all of us.
And if I could just elaborate too, I think that's a great point, and it also includes the critical minerals, because it's thought that there's considerable critical mineral wealth across the Arctic, and renewable energy technologies, whether you're talking about electric vehicles or solar panels or energy storage, rely on those minerals, which right now are pretty concentrated in a few places and not necessarily places where there's supply problems there. So that's one of the reasons too, whether you're talking about a legacy energy economy with oil and gas or the future, the energy transition, where you're talking about renewables, the Arctic and the minerals there become very important.
Excellent, thank you. With everybody's indulgence, we're going to go a couple minutes over with a hard out at 10:40, if that's okay. I want to fit in one question before I then pose some audience quickfire. But I want to make sure to touch on the other aspect of the Arctic Council that sometimes gets overlooked, and that is the indigenous populations. There are 6 indigenous peoples organizations that are permanent participants in the Arctic Council, and they represent about 500,000 inhabitants in the Arctic. So I wanted to know, I pose this to all panelists, whoever wants to weigh in. How does the role of indigenous peoples play into some of the dynamics that we have been discussing today, and how can those peoples continue to be stakeholders in these issues? Whoever, Coordinator DeHart, I see you nodding your head, so why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, because it's a very important question. One important aspect of the Arctic Council is the indigenous peoples, the permanent participants are at the table, at the main table, not in some back row, but they've got a full voice in those deliberations that take place there. And it's one of the things that I think makes the Arctic Council really unique and really, really strong. I think getting back to the theme I mentioned earlier in our interim national security guidance, the importance of connecting our foreign policy efforts to our domestic policy efforts. Really important for us with the state of Alaska. And we need to show, and indeed we need to have the benefits for our citizens of our foreign policy approaches. In the Arctic context, there's a really important question here of how do we align our climate change goals with the need for sustainable economic development across the region. How do we send the right signals on business, doing the right kind of business in accordance with high standards and approaches that support our goals on climate? Because the local Arctic communities need investment. They're hungry for investment. And this is a policy challenge. And I think we've got some work to do to get it right. Critical minerals, really important. Key to a future green economy. I would just make one point about this. you often see in the press the sort of narrative that the big powers are sort of battling over the critical minerals, and it's a bit of a great game over who gets, the critical minerals where. I just want to say the local people have a say. And as we've seen recently in Greenland, the local people have a say on what happens where they live. And so there's got to be a good dialogue with the communities that are impacted by our policies.
I'm just going to look for a show of hands if anybody else wants to weigh in before we go to some audience questions in the last few minutes. Okay, why don't we turn to a question from Yeli, who asks, what opportunities are there for the tech sector to drive innovation on Arctic issues? Tomas, you seem to allude to some of the innovation that is taking place. So perhaps do you want to start with this question?
It's no secret that doing business in the Arctic is expensive, but at the same time, we see that, for instance, in Russia, where Norilsk Nickel, which is the world's largest producer of nickel and a major producer of copper and cobalt as well, when they get some tax exemptions for investment into environmental friendly technology, they take that opportunity and they boost it as a marketing argument for selling their minerals. So it works good up in the north.
Who else wants to weigh in on this? Okay, Katarzyna.
Just a short comment. I think because I mentioned the new and breakthrough technologies we see being worked on, and some are tested, some are even being deployed. And I mentioned them in the context of weapons systems development, infrastructure, etc. And of course, that's one sort of pathway. But at the same time, all these technologies can also be applied to make this environment, this extremely harsh environment to operate in, safer. For maritime, strengthening maritime domain awareness and general domain awareness, human assistance, disaster relief, crisis management, search and rescue. I think that's one area where these technological opportunities lay. Of course, commercial developments, energy extraction, maritime shipping is another one. So for years, we've been talking about the fact that some of the maritime shipping routes are very difficult to operate with. They are shallow, some of the passages, they are narrow, etc. And the ice there will be very unpredictable. Which passages will be open, which will be not, for instance, along the Northern Sea Route. So new designs on ships that could be more profitable, easier and safer to operate is yet another area where the technological developments could actually make the region safer and for everybody. Thank you.
And I would emphasize that the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technologies are important for everything in the region, and it's a very challenging environment, not just on the ground, but in the air. So those technologies and innovation there are going to be very important. Also, the technologies that are being developed to deal with permafrost melting and how you adapt to that are going to be increasingly interesting. And that whole challenge of resilience in the region and how you adapt is already producing some really interesting innovations. So I think that'll be a space to watch as well. And then on mining, again, the critical minerals, and I think the coordinator's comment about the indigenous population has a really important role there too. Traditionally, both mining and processing of minerals is a very destructive activity, and research and development into how to have low footprint, less destructive technologies is going to be very important. We don't want to, in an energy transition, substitute one really polluting, destructive process for another.
Coordinator DeHart, I want to pose one last question to you and also invite you to weigh in on the previous one if you wish. But I wanted to get in one more question from the audience. This is from Robert English, who asks, are more US or joint NATO freedom of navigation operations planned for or are a priority in the future for the United States in the Arctic region?
I have nothing to announce at this time. But look, freedom of navigation for the United States being a global power, it's a very important principle for us. We conduct such operations, when appropriate around the world. So they can have their value, but I have no plans for the Arctic region to indicate now. Thanks.
Okay, and I thank Robert for helping me with the journalistic ending on a journalistic note there, trying to make some news. I thank all the panelists and the Atlantic Council for hosting this fantastic conversation. Before we all break, before the next session at 10:50 a.m., you can click the link in the chat to join the next session that begins at 10:50 a.m. And that is, of course, the conversation, the keynote and fireside chat with Minister of Defense Bakke-Jensen, and moderated by Sherry Goodman. So thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Welcome back, everyone, for the second half of our very exciting Arctic Security Conference at the Atlantic Council. I'm Sherry Goodman. I'm a board director at the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. I want to again deeply thank the Norwegian Ministry of Defense and the Royal Norwegian Embassy, and thank all of our earlier speakers, including the ambassador and the foreign minister, who both gave brilliant remarks, as well as very good panelists. Now it's my deep privilege and honor to introduce to you all the Norwegian Minister of Defense, Frank Bakke-Jensen, who has served in this capacity for 3 years. And he has deep experience in this area, having worked previously in the EU, and he has also served in Parliament and as a mayor, and so he served in the UN Interim Force for Lebanon UNIFIL earlier in his career. So he brings a deep set of experiences to a very talented department and a very important topic, and we're really looking forward to your remarks this morning, Mr. Minister. Sorry we can't be with you in Norway this year, but we're very happy to see you virtually online, and welcome to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Mrs. Goodman. Thank you. And it is a great pleasure to speak to you from my Arctic hometown of Tromsø. As my colleague the Minister of Foreign Affairs pointed out, around 9% of our population lives north of the Arctic Circle. However, the High North is our strategic center, both because of its strategic importance and the wealth of resources found here. The Arctic region has always been of great significance to transatlantic security, an importance that is only increasing. As climate change opens new sailing routes and ice-free areas, the Arctic is commercially more interesting. We also witness increased military activity and more strategic signaling. This is primarily a function of increased geopolitical rivalry and competition in general. It's not a function of the dynamic in the region itself. It is therefore important to see the development in the Arctic in a broader context. Norway follows this development closely as the only NATO member bordering Russia in the High North. Russian armed forces have significantly modernized during the last 10 to 12 years. Its capabilities are increasingly integrated, giving Russia a much more capable and flexible tool. Russian presence in the Arctic has increased through both military and civilian infrastructure. The Russians have modernized their underwater capabilities. They have improved their ability to deploy troops rapidly over great distances. Russia is now also more capable in terms of conventional long-range precision weapons. Together, this reduces the warning time for NATO countries to hours and days. We also see more Russian maritime activity in waters close to Norway. The Barents Sea is optimal for testing new weapon systems. The Russian activities now more complex and take place in our areas further west and south than before, demonstrating Russia's ability to project force far into the Atlantic. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned, the revived bastion defense concept includes vast areas of the Atlantic. And from its new airbase on Franz Josef's Land, Russia is now able to conduct air operations over vast areas in the Arctic. This Russian ability to reduce NATO's freedom of movement is particularly worrying for transatlantic security. At the same time, China's interest in the Arctic is increasing. China has defined itself as a near Arctic state, and we expect them to be more active there in the future. China has also strengthened its icebreaker capacity, and its space-related activities also involves the Arctic. The Chinese presence and activity in the Arctic is still modest. However, it is important to follow these developments closely. We also see that Russia and China are developing their strategic partnership. However, the two countries do not always share the same interests, especially when it comes to areas that Russia perceives as its core interest regarding national security. Together, these developments mean that Norway and NATO need to maintain and strengthen deterrence and defense in the Arctic region. And I would like to emphasize 4 aspects that are essential to Norway and to the alliance. First, NATO must continue to strengthen its ability to operate in the transatlantic area. The defense of this area depends on secure sea lanes of communication across the Atlantic. We must therefore be able to handle threats to our freedom of movement at sea. The establishment of Joint Force Command Norfolk contributes to this, as well as the resurrection of the US Second Fleet. Joint defense plans and increased situational awareness are vital. So it's regular training and operations in an Arctic climate. Therefore, Norway welcomes allied training and presence in the Arctic. The Arctic is a very important area for the cooperation between the United States and Norway. As we speak, the US Air Force is conducting operations with 4 of its B-1 bombers from Ørland Air Base in central Norway. This deployment represents a unique opportunity for cooperation and joint training with the Norwegian Air Force, land forces, and Navy. Allied activity in the region shows allied cohesion, as well as our shared interest in maintaining the Euro-Atlantic space as a region characterized by freedom, peace, and stability. At the same time, the scope of allied activities must be measured to avoid unnecessary escalation and misunderstandings. Second, Norway must continue to contribute to NATO's collective defense and deterrence. European allies have to take greater responsibility for maintaining allied capacity. We must improve the burden sharing within the alliance. Norway takes its share of this responsibility. Since 2013, we have increased our defense budget with 30% in real terms. We spend 2% of GDP on defense, and we have a high investment rate of about 29%. We have invested in new strategic capabilities such as F-35 fighters, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, and submarines. We are also increasing the capabilities of our intelligence service. Together, these measures strengthen Norway's presence in the Arctic, thus increasing our ability to maintain a good situational awareness on behalf of the alliance. This improves our ability to protect Norwegian sovereignty and contribute to allied security in the Arctic region. Third, it is essential for Norway to maintain and develop our relationship and cooperation with the United States. As my colleague said, the United States is our most important ally, a long-standing partner in the Arctic and of critical importance to Norwegian security. We have long-standing cooperations within all services, as seen with the B-1 bombers currently training in Norway, and the regular training and exercises with the forces from the US Marine Corps. This training is an opportunity for US forces to improve its ability to operate in an Arctic climate, and for our forces to increase their interoperability. We also have significant cooperation within the military industry as well as research and development. Norway always also contributes to the full spectrum of US and NATO-led operations. Together, all of this strengthens our bilateral relationship. Fourth, for Norway, it's important to maintain the balance between deterrence and reassurance vis-à-vis Russia. NATO must also preserve that balance. We want to be transparent and predictable, and we expect the same from Russia. Dialogue and communication about our intentions is an important confidence and security building measure. As mentioned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, our neighbor has over the past few years become more expansive and less predictable, making Russia a strategic challenge and a demanding neighbor. Even though Norway is realistic in our relationship with Russia, Norway's long-term goal remains to have the best possible relationship. We believe that we and our allies, as well as Russia, have a common interest in maintaining stability in the Arctic region. Finally, let me thank the Atlantic Council for our excellent partnership. Arena that foster dialogue and cooperation are welcome, and I appreciate this opportunity to participate in this year's conference on Arctic security. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. That was a very complete and comprehensive a set of remarks. And so let me engage you in some discussion about that. Thank you for raising the presence of the U.S. Air Force already there in Norway on cooperation, and you talked about the longstanding Marine Corps cooperation with the PRIPO in Norway, and all of that is excellent. And you probably know that the United States Army just recently released its new Arctic strategy, talking about how to re-equip and better prepare land forces to operate in the Arctic region. So thank you for having touched on the Air Force and the Marine Corps and speaking so deeply of U.S.-Norwegian defense cooperation. Maybe you could also share with us now your thoughts about cooperation with the U.S. Army in the Arctic. And also, I know there's also maritime cooperation with naval forces, both through NATO, but also through the U.S. Navy. And you have some former military officers now at the Naval War College, deepening our cooperation here in the U.S. as well. So why don't you discuss a little bit how you expect that to unfold?
Well, we will see the cooperation between U.S. and Norway will develop in many fields. But I think also there's an important dimension of the allied exercises in the Arctic in Norway, because we also see a Nordic dimension on this exercises. We are working more closely with Sweden and Finland, which is not NATO countries, but are alliance-free nations, but part of the Western Defense Cooperation. And we have, through the last years, have a lot of exercises with our US friends, including exercising with Sweden and also Finland, both air and land cooperation. So I think we will see a more complex, but also a part that NATO will, through the US and Norwegian cooperation, also we will include Sweden and Finland more, and that also draw the picture, because then we see the Arctic, the Barents Sea, but we also see the Baltic countries and the southern part of the Nordic coastline involved in that. So we through the Nordic Baltic and the other regional models of cooperation, we will develop the exercise and defense cooperation also on to Sweden and Finland.
Well, thank you. And I know, of course, Trident Juncture has been very important. And I know there's a new exercise, Reindeer, with the land forces and deepening that cooperation. So let me ask you then, what keeps you up at night about Russia's increased military posture in the Arctic region and close to the Norwegian border?
Well, mostly our if I have doubts in our ability to keep dialogue and cooperation with Russia, we are working on an open dialogue with Russia. That's important for us. We are a small country with a big neighbor, and we need to create a dialogue and relationship which is rule-based, agreement-based. So we suspended the military cooperation after Crimea in 2014, but we retain cooperation on issues critical to security in High North. We have a long-standing and really good cooperation between Russian and Norwegian Coast Guard. Our Coast Guard is part of our armed forces. And we have a hotline between the Norwegian Joint Headquarters and the Northern Fleet. We see more also allied activity in the north, and for us it's important to do these exercises and cooperation as transparent as possible. So we're working also with our Russian neighbors to help avoid misunderstandings and accidents in our areas. So we need to deter, but we also need to be open, transparent, and a predictable neighbor for Russia. So we are using a lot of resources to build good defense and good deterrence, but we also use a lot of resources and efforts to create a better climate for dialogue and cooperation on Russia.
So along those lines, as you noted, prior to Russia's incursion in Crimea and aggression in 2014, there was dialogue among security forces that extended the already extensive Coast Guard dialogue that continues to this day, but the security dialogue with Russia has been in abeyance for good reason since that time. But as military activities increase in the region, do you see a need for some form of renewed or some expanded channels of communication among security forces to avoid miscalculation, reduce risk, and avoid conflict?
Well, at least we need to try. So we are trying to develop our hotline between the Norwegian operating headquarters and the Northern Fleet. Our the Ministry of Defense have regular meetings with the Russian Ministry of Defense. So we try to create as good channels as possible, and that's also why I think it's important for us to lift what we are successful with. So that's why we are lifting the Coast Guard, we are lifting the search and rescue agreement and the search and rescue exercises we're doing with the Russians to in a way show that this is a topic we are taking serious, which we would like to improve, but at the same time we have the measures we need to point out on Crimea and what happened there. So on one side we international law is important for us because we're a small country, and we state that law should go before power, and then at the same time we also need to create some arenas where we can cooperate with a big neighbor.
Great. Well, that's very thorough. I know we're almost out of time, but if you want, I'd like to give you just one more opportunity to comment on China's ambitions in the Arctic. You mentioned them. You see increasing presence of activity, not necessarily military in nature, but increasing presence overall on research and a capability to operate in the Arctic. How do you think about that in terms of your roles and missions?
Well, we see them active on science. We see them active on research on international law. We see them cooperating with Russia on resources, oil and gas. We don't see them with any military presence in the Arctic, but we know that China is working on other arenas to create their own space. So we know they are working on investments in the Arctic. They are working to create cooperation on industry and resources. So we are looking on what they are doing, follow them. At the same time, I don't think Russia is too keen on giving China to a big role in the Arctic, because they're working together, but they're not that good friends. So I think they will try to balance it. But it's a question whether we how we should make the West relevant for Russia, also in industry and resources, balancing the fact that we can't accept what they did in Crimea at the time. So they are dancing a difficult tango here, and we need to have a good situational awareness, and then we need to look out for what's happening. China has been active on Greenland. They have been acting on many arenas in the north to make themselves relevant, and we need to look out and see what's happening.
Mr. Minister, thank you for those very thoughtful and comprehensive remarks this morning, and for engaging with me in dialogue. And we always welcome you back at the Atlantic Council, you and your wonderful team. I wish you a very good day. And now I'm privileged to turn it over to the next terrific panel. It's going to be led by Anna Wieslander of the Atlantic Council. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for that. And welcome to all of you to this session. I'm sending from Stockholm, so it's not above the Arctic Circle, but it's certainly an Arctic state, and the Northern European office of the Atlantic Council here since 2016. So we will discuss here on how to bridge the perspectives on the Arctic between Europe and the US and Canada. And we have an excellent set of speakers to to do that. I will give them, we don't have much time, so this will be short and punchy. 3 minutes of remarks for each speaker, and then I hope we can have some discussion and also feed in some of the questions from the audience here. And I would like us to address a few core questions then. How do allies in Europe see the challenge in the Arctic differently than the United States and Canada? And moving forward, how can the transatlantic community manage divergent perspectives, particularly when it comes to security? And what are the policy implications of the increased attention on the region? And for the panel, please don't be too polite either, because if there are no differences, we cannot bridge them. So let's see if we can carve out if there are any perspectives that differ across the Atlantic. And I would like us to move first to Peter Hammerschmidt, who is Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy at the Department of National Defense of Canada. Please, Peter, what is your view?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for having us on the panel here today. Very happy to be participating, and very nice to see all of my fellow panelists. So obviously Arctic, hugely important to Canada. It's fundamental to us. It's part of our heritage, part of our identity, a big part of our future, of course, as a country. And we need to really be thinking about the Arctic on the long-term basis and with our climate lens on. You know, for all the challenges that climate change presents for the world, I think for a number of nations, including all of us that are represented here on the panel, it's going to present also unparalleled opportunity. And as the northern regions, as the Arctic becomes more temperate, opens up, there'll be tremendous opportunity for all of our countries. So from a Canadian perspective, I think as we look out 50 years from now, we see ourselves as likely to be in a bit of a climate sweet spot for human activity, right? More arable land, more accessible natural resources, more open Arctic transportation routes. So we're going to be a very attractive place to be on the planet from the point of view of resources, climate, and migration. So we stand to gain enormously, but from our perspective, we really need to be able to take advantage of all that opportunity. We're going to need to be in a position to protect our North and our Arctic. You know, food insecurity, scarcer natural resources, climate migration, all of that is going to mean that our countries are going to be, other countries are going to be very interested in all of our northern and Arctic areas. So we're going to need to be prepared for that. And I think we'll need to be prepared by making investments now, but also strengthening all of our cooperation now to ensure that we can collectively protect our Arctic interests. You know, we're starting to see all of these changes already. I won't go into much detail given the time limitations, and you know, the Minister Rebecca Jensen has touched on all of these already. But climate change is introducing security challenges. Other countries are introducing security challenges. And strategic competition is really unfolding in the region. So the Arctic, from our perspective, is at an inflection point. You're seeing climate change, economic interest, geostrategic competition come together in a way that makes the region much more strategically important than the past. So again, we really need to be prepared to take that head on. And from a Canadian perspective, our priority is really about ensuring that the Arctic remains a region of low tension, a region of cooperation, and a region where ultimately the rules-based international order prevails and is preserved. One part of our plan for achieving all of that is to make the necessary defense investments to ensure that we can protect our sovereignty, we can strengthen our deterrence and our national resilience, and be a valuable partner ultimately in North American defense as well as global collective defense. And we're starting from a strong foundation. We have a permanent military presence in the North, anchored by Joint Task Force North in Yellowknife. We have over 1,800 Canadian Rangers across 60 communities in the region. And we're making a series of significant investments under our defense policy that will enhance our northern capabilities, such as fighter aircraft, new surface combatants, Arctic offshore patrol ships, space-based surveillance and communications capabilities, and upgrades to some of our infrastructure. But really, that's just the start. We're also going to be working in the weeks and the months and the years ahead with our U.S. partners to enhance our joint defense of our shared continent and particularly in the Arctic space. I think many of you know that Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden recently committed to expanding cooperation on continental defense and Arctic security, including the modernization of NORAD, which is our binational North American Aerospace Defense Command. So core to that work is going to be replacing some of the surveillance capabilities in the North Warning System. Given the new threat environment, we see it being replaced with a layered system of systems, a network of integrated sensors that will operate across all domains from underwater out to space. We'll be looking at modern pan-domain command control and communications, at infrastructure requirements and other initiatives to improve our ability to project and sustain forces in the Arctic. And these investments in the North will also bring further benefits to other parts of government. They're going to advance other domestic priorities in the Arctic, such as creating jobs, growing economies, advancing our green and innovation agendas, and other priorities. So all of those things together will help really contribute to security in our Arctic. The final point I make is really just about cooperation with our partners. And that's really a priority from a Canadian perspective. We see that as absolutely necessary for our collective security in the Arctic. So we're deepening our defense cooperation with Arctic allies, such as Norway and Denmark. We're increasing, for example, surveillance and monitoring the broader Arctic region. We regularly invite Arctic allies and other key partners, such as the UK, to participate in Operation Nanook, which is our signature northern operation. And ultimately, we're actively working with NATO to ensure the alliance can deter, defend, and undertake operation throughout its entire area of responsibility, which includes the European High North and the North Atlantic. And from a Canadian perspective, and Minister Becca Jensen touched on this, cooperating with NATO allies to protect those sea lines of communication is going to be absolutely vital. Crossing the Atlantic to support Europe in the event of a conflict will, for Canada, be an operation unto itself. We're going to have to fight our way across the Atlantic. And moreover, if were there to be a conflict involving the alliance in the future, from our perspective, we don't think it's going to be confined to just the European theater. We think it's going to be much more global in nature. And so that deterrence value of protecting NATO's western flank for Canada cannot be overstated. And that's why we really see our efforts to strengthen continental defense, to modernize NORAD is really essential to ensure that North America is secure and therefore better able to project forces, including in support of our NATO allies. So maybe I'll stop there. I think I ran over. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that excellent start. And we will go on, and I would like to invite Her Excellency Lone Denker Wiesborg, Ambassador of Denmark, for the next remark.
Thank you very much, Anna. I was listening to your lead-in questions, and to be absolutely honest, I find it quite hard to find all these differences. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but after having listened to Peter Hammerschmidt, I don't find them either. I think I could almost have held his speech and he could have held mine maybe, but let me try to give you a few sort of Danish perspectives on this. So let me start by echoing what Peter said and what has also been said earlier, that the Arctic region is a place with enormous potential. But it's also influenced by challenges. And I think we should acknowledge the challenges, but not over-exaggerate them either. A lot is working well in the Arctic region, and we have solid institutions and networks in place, and there's a good track record for cooperation. At the same time, obviously, we have to be clear-eyed about the situation. As we've heard, Russia is building up militarily in the Arctic, even though the focus is mainly defensive. Some elements might be used for more offensive purposes. And we have also seen China's increased ambitions and interests in the Arctic relating to their desire for access to natural resources and sea routes, among other things. Across the Arctic states, there is work ongoing to strengthen our military capabilities. Peter also mentioned that. The Kingdom of Denmark, too, has increased its military presence in the northern Atlantic and the Arctic. We have generations of experience and know-how in operating militarily 24/7, all year long in the Arctic and northern Atlantic region. And our commitment is ongoing. we have just launched a $240 million capability package, which will boost our surveillance, our communications, and command and control even further over the coming years. And this is for us a testament to the importance we attach to this region. Our military purpose is not to increase tension, obviously, but to monitor and safeguard our national territory. And engagement with local communities and working to protect the fragile Arctic environment are key in these endeavors. We try to follow a multidimensional approach based on the new geostrategic reality in the Arctic. And centrally placed is the strengthened cooperation with allies and partners, as Peter also mentioned, as well as our cooperation internally between the three parts of the Kingdom of Denmark, i.e. Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Denmark. As a co-signatory of the Ilulissat Declaration from 2008, the Kingdom of Denmark considers that the Arctic coastal states have a special responsibility for ensuring peace and stability, and this remains the core of our approach. And having listened to the discussion so far, I want to close my remarks by reflecting on the shared, not the diverging, but the shared transatlantic perspectives when it comes to the Arctic. In a recent op-ed, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin described partnerships, allies, and close relations as force multipliers. I think this also goes in an Arctic context. Despite the very different nature of all the countries that are present here today, I think it's striking that we share the same analysis, that there is a massive potential in the Arctic region and beyond, but that we need to protect that potential. And only by working together can we meet the challenges. And just like we need to unleash this vast potential, we also share the need for continuing to discuss how best to protect this region between Europe and the US and Canada. And I see no diverging messages that change that. Thanks a lot, Anna.
Thank you so much. Although you disappointed me, of course, a bit then on the drama here. But let's see then. We're moving on. Thank you so much to Norway and Henning Waglum, who is Director General for Security Policy at the Ministry of Defense. So please, Henning, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you, everyone. Great to see you all. And a lot has already been said from Norwegians today, so I'll be very brief, but a few quick points from my side as well. Focusing primarily on the military strategic development and importance of the Arctic. So first, a quick reminder that the Arctic is many things, but in geostrategic military terms, it's important to remind ourselves that it is the home of the largest concentration of non-Western military power, situated across the border from Norway in the Russian Arctic, the Northern Fleet. This is capabilities that are increasing, both on the classic and novel nuclear capabilities, but the conventional capabilities of Russia in the Arctic are also increasing, enabling Russia to project power in a new way, particularly through the development of new underwater systems and long-range precision strike. We are seeing at least the capability of holding Europe and others at risk in a different way. So this capability development in itself is of strategic importance. We do not see the Arctic militarily either as a crisis, but we do see the developments militarily in the Arctic as a growing strategic challenge. Second, just to highlight what's been said already, China has a stated interest in the Arctic. While their military activity at best is very modest, the long-term interest in the Arctic is very clearly stated, and that is reason enough to be vigilant about that development. And third, we believe NATO has a role in the Arctic today. As Peter said, the NATO AOR contains the European High North today. And given the developments particularly from Russia, there is a need to increase both activity and presence. And that's why the developments from the US and from NATO over the last few years are significant. And the command structure of NATO, and the standing up of the Second Fleet, and in more exercises and activities in the North Atlantic and the High North. And finally, as we maintain the goal of low tension in the Arctic, and the goal of continued cooperation with all Arctic nations, we believe that this coordinated military presence from allies continues to be important, but also that we continuously have to mature the way in which we manage our posture in the North, so as to maximize the intentional deterrence effect, but also to minimize the potential of unintended escalation. It has to be very clear to everyone that the Arctic should remain an area of stability and low tension. That requires deterrence, but it also requires us to avoid provoking unnecessarily, as we like to say here. We believe it's very possible to find that balance, and I want to thank everyone involved, including the US, the UK, Canada, Denmark, and others, in finding good ways between Arctic allies, but also within NATO, of maintaining this important balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Henning, and interesting to hear that view and also highlight the strategic importance of developments in the Arctic. And we're moving on to not an Arctic state, but the nearest neighbor, as I think it says in the integrated review, of the UK. So I'd like to welcome Angus Lapsley, who is Director General, Strategy and International at the British Ministry of Defence. Please, Angus.
Thank you, Anna. And as you say, I'm quite a long way from the Arctic here. I'm down in Canterbury in southeast England, where the closest we get is watching Swedish crime dramas. But I'm afraid I'm not going to produce that much drama because actually, I mean, Peter, Henning and I, we all do the same sort of job, and we have a habit of finishing each other's sentences because we really do see a lot of this very like-minded. But I suppose the difference is because Britain is, we're not one of those states who has stewardship of the Arctic and the High North. I suppose the slight difference is we tend to see it more through how the Arctic fits into broader strategic challenges. And I mean, I'm going to talk about the defence ones, but I think it's worth noting that the UK sees the Arctic through a broader lens. We think it's extremely important for climate and for climate science, and indeed, we announced in our integrated review earlier this week that we're going to put more money into Arctic science for precisely that reason. But we also, I think, see it increasingly as potentially an important vector of international trade. If the Arctic, if the Northern Passage begins to open up, or either of the two Northern Passages, then over time that could start to impact on global trade patterns, because for most Europeans it will become the fastest route to, or the shortest route at least, to Northeast Asia and the Northern Pacific. From a defence perspective, I think we in the UK think about the Arctic for four main reasons. The first actually is the countries on this call, who are amongst our closest allies on defence. Whether we're talking about the Arctic or what we do together in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever it might be in the world, you don't find many closer partners for the UK on defence than from the countries on this call, including increasingly Sweden, even though it's not a NATO ally. So the first point, I think, if it matters to your security and it matters to NATO, it matters to us. I think the second reason is Russia, and in our integrated review this week, we were very clear that we regard Russia as the most acute security threat to the UK, and as Henning brought out, an awful lot of Russian capability is based in the High North and the Arctic. And therefore, we think about how that threat could play into our own security. I think the third reason is, and again, it's been mentioned, is China. And I think the realization that China is, as we put it in our review this week, a systemic challenger to the global order. And it's quite obvious that China is interested in the Arctic. And it could be another one of the vectors which China arrives in the European space. And then I think the fourth reason, which is not unique to this group because the United States shares it as well, but the Arctic and the High North is extremely important to strategic deterrence. And the Greenland-Iceland UK gap, as it's known, is as important to the balance of strategic deterrence and also the sea control of the North Atlantic. That remains as important today as it has been ever since the Cold War, during the Cold War, and indeed before that. I mean, it was a key theatre for us during World War II as well. So, understanding what's happening there, the ability to understand what Russian naval forces are doing in particular is extremely important to us. And one of the things we continue to invest in, for example, being able to operate our submarines underneath the ice. And that's why I'm wearing my US Connecticut t-shirt today, having participated in an ICEX exercise that we did with the US a couple of years ago. Just in terms of the kind of investments we're making, so we are going through a major recapitalization of our anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which are essentially focused on the North Atlantic and the High North. So we're building a new generation of frigates, which is in cooperation with Canada. And we've invested in a new generation of maritime patrol aircraft, the same aircraft that Norway and the US operates. And indeed, up in Scotland now, you're now starting to see British and American planes operating together from the same bases. And shortly we'll be able to do that with Norway as well. But we're also investing a lot in the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a group of countries, mostly in NATO, but also including Finland and Sweden, for which the UK provides a kind of framework nation service, if you like, to allow those countries more flexibility and ability to deploy principally in Northern Europe, but not exclusively. And in particular, I think if you're looking to manage tension or restore deterrence, but you're not at the stage where NATO needs to invoke Article 5, then the JEF provides a flexible way for those countries who want to use it to operate and maintain and restore deterrence. I'd say just a couple of last few things. I mean, as a maritime nation, we are always very preoccupied by maintaining the UNCLOS system. The right of free passage is a really important underlying international legal principle for us. And you know, I think it's going to be interesting how that develops over the Northern Passage in the next few years. But it's something that I think you will see the UK wanting to take a stance on, and possibly a bit more than that. I think both Peter and Henning mentioned space, and you know, I think this is an area that we're also looking to invest in, partly because of the ability to get much better situational awareness, and like Norway and Canada, I think, you know, we are looking at moving down the road of small low Earth orbit satellites, which allow us much better coverage of space, including in the high north and the Arctic. So, you know, I think in sum, I would say most of the themes of UK defence at the moment, most of the themes about how we make sure we maintain deterrence and manage increasingly active competition in the sub-threshold space between states. Most of these things will play out in the Arctic in one form or another. And I think Britain's ambition is to be a serious, credible and productive and sort of constructive player in that space. Doing so, as everyone has brought out, you know, in a transparent and predictable way. And we all recognize Russia has legitimate interests in the high north and Arctic. That's perfectly fair. So we don't want to be provocative, but we do want to show that we can operate there, whether it's our frigates pushing up into the Barents Sea, as they've done twice this year, whether it's pushing up into the Baltic Sea, as we're doing this week, or whether it's our Marines and Air Force operating and training in Norway, as they've been doing for many, many years now. I think that, you know, that's the kind of contribution that we want to make.
Thank you so much, Angus. Excellent overview. And we are moving over to our last speaker of the panel with the US, who has released for the services various Arctic strategies. I think the Naval came this fall, if I recall correctly, and the Army just also had its Arctic strategy out this week. And I would like to welcome Jennifer Walsh, who is performing the duties of the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the US Department of Defense. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for putting this on, and to my fellow panelists. It's great to see in particular Henning Waglum, because we started working together about 20 years ago on the US-Norway relationship. The Arctic security and Arctic stability is absolutely a priority for the Department of Defense, and it's a very important issue for me in particular, given my history working with the Nordic region. I am not going to introduce drama here. This conversation is not new to the collection of countries represented here. And so as we have differences of views, we have ways to work those out. So no drama from the US injecting into this conversation. But I would like to identify some areas where the US is focused and moving forward. Our priorities and our objectives with respect to this region are aligned with what others have said. It's about maintaining the Arctic as a secure and stable region. For the United States, it's also about looking at this region through the lens of defending our homeland. And then as the President and the Secretary of Defense have said, cooperation with allies and partners is more important than ever. And I see this being particularly valued in the Arctic region. So I expected coming into this conversation, and has been reaffirmed through my fellow panelists' comments, that we agree on many issues, including that building awareness on the Arctic issues in play is extremely important, both to understand the opportunities, to anticipate where there may be challenges or threats, and also to be able to communicate what are the norms that we are establishing for behaviors in this region. Enhancing our operations and our cooperation. The United States, through the Department of Defense, has bilateral military activities with Canada, Denmark, Norway, the UK, other countries, specifically focused on demonstrating our capabilities to operate in this region. And then important for all of us is ensuring that the rules-based order is applied and then enforced in this region. These are essential principles and bases for our future calls to action when we're considering our respective interests, but also our collective activities. We may see the challenges or how we prioritize these challenges or what order or sequence of actions we take to respond to these challenges in different ways, but that doesn't mean that we disagree. And for those areas where we eventually may have divergent views or disagreements, I expect the transatlantic community will react as it has on so many different issues, and that is through communication, collaboration, and cooperation. We're going to pursue our outreach on Arctic issues through very well-known venues and standing processes. The Arctic Council, first among equals and bodies to look at issues in this region, but separately through security issues, which the Arctic Council doesn't get into. We're going to continue our bilateral work with countries on this call and around the world, those who are expressing interest in having more play or at least better understanding of what's going on in the Arctic. And then through NATO, as NATO considers how it's going to organize for either greater awareness or taking more action or having greater presence in the high north, the US will be there too. For DoD, we see two primary challenges to the security and stability in this region, and I will be echoing what others have already said. First, Russia. We are not looking to invite or provoke any type of conflict or escalatory actions, militarily or otherwise, in the Arctic. But we have been watching Russia's behavior around the world. And as it continues to develop its presence and its capabilities in the Arctic, we have to be able to connect some dots and think forward about what should we be anticipating from Russia in this region. Even if its interests right now are focused on territorial defense, how far will it go to increase its oversight or control of northern sea routes as those open up? Second, China. We know China is seeking a larger role in shaping governance and security issues to advance its Arctic ambitions. China's behavior in other parts of the world should be considered in the context of will it follow suit in the Arctic region as well. So we're watching those, but no crisis right now, and our objective, as is everyone's, is to prevent a crisis. You had also asked us to look at what are the policy implications for increased attention on the region. A top one, I won't try to repeat what others have said, but for the United States, we have to consider what do changes in the Arctic region really mean for our defense of the homeland? As Russia increases its presence, China asserts itself, and other countries look to take advantage in positive or negative ways for the new potential commercial transit routes, we're going to have to consider whether that the greater activity invites additional or different threats or concerns to our homeland security. And I expect every Arctic nation will be doing the same thing. So this is where the cooperation, collaboration, and communication will come into play even more. Next, picking up on what others have said, ensuring the common domains remain free and open. This is absolutely a whole of government effort, but it's absolutely also one that the Department of Defense has a role in and takes seriously. We have assets and capabilities that our civilian agencies do not. And we expect that all nations, Arctic nations, will share in this objective and principle too. Upholding international law and common practice is going to require our commercial, foreign policy, and security sectors to work through what are the norms that we want to establish and what do we want to enforce in this region. And of course, anytime there are policy implications, what quickly follows are the resource implications. So depending on whether and how Arctic realities unfold from a security standpoint, the Department of Defense will be considering how do we shape, scope, or modify our investments required to achieve both the opportunities and also the challenges for the region. And in that regard, too, this will bring us back to my triad of transatlantic words of communication, collaboration, and cooperation. This is shared space, it's shared opportunity, but it's also shared responsibility. And the Department of Defense looks forward to continuing to play our part. And I'll close there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. It's very interesting to hear your assessments. And I would like to pick up on the issue of NATO and what NATO should do. We have heard here about how the stakes are getting higher in the Arctic when it comes to strategic competition entering into the area. We have the strategic challenge posed by China also entering the area. We have Russian modernization and what Henning described, the strategic implications of its power projections well beyond the Arctic. So if we have a question here from Stephen Flanagan at RAND, and I would like to pose that question. As NATO is developing and looking forward to develop a new strategic concept ahead, what should that concept say about NATO's role in the Arctic? If you could say something about that. So what should the strategic concept say about NATO's role in the Arctic? And I would like to add a question that goes back to Becky Jensen's defense minister's, what he said about the Nordic cooperation, that Sweden and Finland are much more also involved in Arctic Nordic cooperation. It also goes down to the Baltic Sea, and this is all connected. How do you foresee that Sweden and Finland, not members of NATO, but close partners to NATO, could be part of this kind of new assessment, continuous assessment that is needed of Arctic developments when it comes to NATO's role? So who would like to start? Are we going, let's go back to Peter. It was a while ago since you had a chance to talk.
Thank you, Anna. I guess just off the top, I mean, the last strategic or the existing strategic concept is a 2010 document for NATO, and all of us recognize, and we've been talking about it today, just how much the world has changed since that point in time. In particular, the behavior we've seen from Russia, but in many other ways, including China too, which we've talked about as well quite a bit. So just the updating of the strategic concept to reflect the new reality is going to be incredibly important, including to NATO's focus on the Arctic. NATO too is going to continue to emphasize the importance of partnerships. And that includes partnerships with non-NATO members in the Arctic, like Finland and Sweden, but also with partners in other parts of the world. So that will be a way to work towards addressing security in the Arctic more broadly. The continued emphasis on deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, that involves as well, as mentioned in some of our remarks today, the need to be able to operate in cold climates and the high Arctic and the Arctic in the north in general. And so NATO will continue to emphasize that as part of its focus going forward. But I think, again, generally the updating of that strategic concept is going to be absolutely critical to reposition partners to focus on the new reality of our strategic environment, which includes a much different Arctic environment and challenge from Russia and from China than we've seen in the past.
Ambassador Alone, would you like to comment on NATO's strategic concept? What do you foresee?
Yeah, so I mean, NATO covers the Arctic, and so it's important that that region receives the necessary attention. And we believe that the increased focus that we see in NATO on the North Atlantic and the Arctic is only natural in light of the new security developments, you could say, and dynamics. Our position is that NATO should focus on strengthening its situational awareness and also support allied presence and exercise activity in order to strengthen our ability to operate jointly in the region. That's where we see, for the moment, NATO's natural role in the Arctic. And when it comes to, you asked about Sweden and Finland, we have been very pleased and have supported actively the closer and closer cooperation between NATO and Finland and Sweden. And Sweden and Finland have long-standing experience with operating under Arctic conditions. So I'm absolutely sure that there's something to learn from them. It will be natural to include that experience in our consultations, NATO, Finland and Sweden. So that's what we would like to see happen. Thank you.
Thank you. So Henning, what's your wish list for the strategic concept?
Well, thank you, Anna, and also thanks to Stephen for a great question. 3 quick points. One, I think the strategic concept should highlight the fact that NATO has a role in the Arctic. There has historically been some doubts about that. It has a role. And second, that the ambition of maintaining the Arctic as an area of cooperation and low tension is important. And third, that that as Jennifer alluded to, both the ability to deter, but also to influence the future norms of presence in the polar ocean is vital because of many reasons, but most importantly because of the area's importance in strategic deterrence. So it is in all of NATO's interest to have a clear, a balanced, but an active both presence and policy on the Arctic. Second, on the Nordics, I would just say that cooperation within the Nordic countries is increasing. We respect different memberships of different organizations, but I think the real reason why this cooperation now is increasing also on military matters is that the analysis of the deteriorating security situation is very similar in all Nordic nations. So there's a new level of seriousness about defense and security also in the Nordic countries, and one of the measures we are all seeing is that more cooperation is needed. And finally, I just have to say, Jennifer, it's wonderful to see you, and I can't believe it's 20 years, but I'm afraid it has been. Good to see you.
Great. Thank you. Angus, please.
So thanks. So 3 points. So firstly, I really agree with Peter that the so-called DDA, the concept for the defense and deterrence of the North Atlantic area, which is a military concept, that is already changing the way NATO approaches the Arctic and the High North. It's already encouraging allies to be more active, more forward, to work closer together. Secondly, so Finland and Sweden, I mean, they are hugely important to maintaining security and defense and deterrence in Northern Europe, partly because they're both actually very capable military powers, but also I think because of that kind of wider awareness and understanding they have of the different ways in which we are being challenged, including ways which are not military. I think some people call it hybrid. I think both those countries, like all of the Northern European countries, actually are really strong in this area, and we need that overall awareness and sense of control. On the next strategic concept, so I have to admit I'm quite sad, and I read the last 3 or 4 strategic concepts the other night, and it's really striking how the last 2 strategic concepts have basically started by saying, well, we in NATO are now pretty safe and secure, so what are we going to do to help the rest of the world? How are we going to go out? And I think one of the core challenges for the next strategic concept is to recognize that whilst NATO may well still be an exporter of security, I hope we will be, we've got to think a little bit about the threats that are coming to us now. And they will come in a 360 way. Some of them will come from the south, some of them will come from the east, some of them will come from the north. So I think all the practical ideas we've heard so far are really good. I think though it'll have to be part of an underlying mindset shift in the next strategic concept, that actually we have to look to our own territorial defense and our own resilience a little bit more, because the world is coming to us. It's not now just a question of whether we go to the world.
Thank you. And Jennifer, please.
Thank you very much. I agree with what Angus just said. I don't see a new strategic concept just picking up where we left off with the last one. I think we have to take a hard look at what are the threats and challenges facing the alliance and our collective interests now, and what we anticipate. And the Arctic, I would argue, has to be a part of that. Obviously, the alliance is facing any number of threats, north, south, east, west, but not all of them are in equal standing. And so I think NATO's work will be putting each of these in an appropriate place, and recognizing that ignoring any will come at our own peril. But it doesn't mean that we treat all of them the same. Still, I'm pleased that NATO is starting to think more about the Arctic region, addressing climate change. The United States looks forward to being a part of that conversation, and evolving and advancing how NATO looks at that. We are always seeking ways to improve our cooperation with allies and partners alike. And so in that regard, the more we can do to optimize and maximize what Sweden and Finland are willing and able to do with the alliance, we're on board. Over.
Thank you so much. And I wish we had more time to discuss, but that's the trade-off here. We have had 5 perspectives from the alliance, and that has been great, but not that much time to perhaps discuss as much. A lot of great questions in the chat, which I unfortunately will not be able to pick up on. But I just want to say that it's interesting that you all mentioned both Russia and China in moving forward, but you all also mentioned this classic formula for the Arctic, high on cooperation and low on tension, as at least also the future ambition and goal of the region, and I think that's positive to hear that we have big challenges, but also opportunities to get this right, I would say. And I think I just want to conclude the whole conference now saying that it's very important, I think, to look north, and that we all do that and make this joint assessment. I'm glad that there were not many differences to bridge. That's we are way on our way here. That's excellent. And I look forward to more discussions of this kind, actually, to build further on the common ground that exists, because it is a crucial area for not only this part of the world, but it has global dimensions. So with that, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for excellent speakers. I know you can't hear the applause, but I'm sure they're there for those who listen to us. And thanks for everyone who has joined us today. And have a great evening and weekend, actually, as it goes here in Europe, at least. Thank you all for joining.